My paper is on the relevance of actual entities to ecological civilization, and I ask you to bear with me because I have some quotations on actual entities, which may be a bit too many, but I think Whitehead puts it better than I, so that's the main reason. The category of actual entity has an overwhelming importance in Whitehead's philosophical system. Any competent grasp of this philosophy is informed by the notion of actual entity. The proper understanding of this Whiteheadian category leads to a worldview which is consentaneous with a well-balanced and integral harmony of all the elements that constitute reality. Wholeness, complexity, and indivisibility are unsurmountable characters of the ultimate metaphysical elements in the actual world. Moreover, a proper understanding of this fundamental Whiteheadian category is essential for the constitution of the basis of a sound ecological civilization. And now I quote, that's my first quote from Process and Reality. Actual entities, also termed actual occasions, are the final real things of which the world is made up. There's no going behind actual entities to find anything more real. They differ amongst themselves. God is an actual entity, and so is the most trivial puff of existence in far-off empty space. But though there are gradations of importance and diversities of function, yet, in the principles which actuality exemplifies, all are on the same level. The final facts are all alike actual entities, and these actual entities are drops of experience, complex and interdependent, unquote. Although actual entities are ultimate, diverse amongst themselves, complex and interdependent, they all have the same ontological nature. They all instantiate the same ultimate principles and have the same ontological dignity. Actual entities, in exemplifying the ultimate principles, constitute themselves as the ultimate elements of reality. And of course, the ultimate principle that they exemplify is creativity, the synthesis of the one which emerges from the many. Creativity, and I quote again, is the universal of universals, characterizing ultimate matter of fact. It is the ultimate principle by which the many, which are the universe disjunctively, become the one actual occasion, which is the universe conjunctively. It lies in the nature of things that the many enter into complex creativity. Into complex unity, Creativity is the principle of novelty. An actual occasion is a novel entity, diverse from any entity in the many which it unifies. The ultimate metaphysical principle is the advance from disjunction to conjunction, creating a novel entity other than the entities given in disjunction. The many become one and are increased by one, unquote. Actual entities are thus the immediate result of creativity. They are units with a novel and unifying character that emerge from the many antecedent occasions, without which they would never have formed themselves. But the formation of any one actual entity is a novel occasion of experience. Actual entities draw on their past, but they are self-determining. Causality is not deterministic. In this way, actual entities can but emerge as drops of experience, complex and interdependent. Whitehead borrows from William James this notion of drops of experience. James writes in a pluralistic universe, time itself comes in drops, and all our sensible experiences as we get them immediately do thus change by discrete pulses of perception. This raises the question of discontinuity, which leads to individualization and atomism. William James discusses the question of discontinuity in Some Problems of Philosophy. He writes, on the discontinuity theory, time, change, etc., would grow by finite buds or drops, either nothing coming at all or certain units of amount bursting into being at a stroke, unquote. Our experience has thus a discrete composition, and reality grows through abrupt units of being that constitute themselves by a single action, which is an addition of novelty to the world. Apart from these abrupt bursts of reality, there is nothing at all. The novel additions to reality are finite and indivisible. Reality seems thus to have an atomistic character. The ultimate elements in reality come into being at a stroke as whole, undivided, and indivisible units of duration. Thus, reality grows by buds or drops of experience. But the Jamesian and Whiteheadian atomisms are often misunderstood. The unitary elements that compose reality are atomic because they lack divisibility and because they form themselves as particular individual units. In this context, the term atom should not be taken as suggesting that actual occasions are minute or transient entities. What is important about them is their temporal unity, which permits a particular individualization and a particular process of coming into being in a particular way that defines that actual entity as such. Actual entities come in different sizes and have different time spans. Their unity and wholeness can sometimes lead us into the mistake of believing they are very small units. Their becoming and perishing may suggest they are short-lived. However, in Process and Reality, Whitehead refers to many different kinds of actual entities. Let us take a most paradigmatic one, Castle Rock in Edinburgh. Whitehead uses Castle Rock as an example of decision, which is inextricable from the actual entity that makes the decision, constituting that very actual entity. He writes, but decision cannot be construed as a causal adjunct of an actual entity. It constitutes the very meaning of actuality. An actual entity arises from decisions for it, and by its very existence provides decisions for other actual entities which supersede it. Decision is the additional meaning imported by the word actual into the phrase actual entity. Actuality is the decision amid potentiality. It represents stubborn fact, which cannot be evaded. The real internal constitution of an actual entity progressively constitutes a decision, conditioning the creativity which transcends that actuality. The Castle Rock at Edinburgh exists from moment to moment and from century to century by reason of the decision effected by its own historic root of antecedent occasions. And if in some vast upheaval of nature it were shattered into fragments, that convulsion would still be conditioned by the fact that it was the destruction of that rock. The point to be emphasized is the insistent particularity of things experienced and of the act of experiencing, unquote. The existence of Castle Rock is thus internally linked to the decision originating in past occasions which refer to that particular rock as such, that is, as something that is determined in its own individuality and particularity. In this way, Castle Rock emerges unquestionably as an actual entity, in spite of its big dimensions and of its temporal endurance. It should be noted that indivisibility refers to the process of becoming and of constitution of an actual entity. Objectified entities can be the object of analysis and can therefore be divided. Whitehead writes, the actual entity is divisible, but is in fact undivided. The divisibility can thus only refer to its objectifications in which it transcends itself, unquote. Thus the primordial elements in the process of being proceed as unitary wholes. The constitution of the elements of reality is a process of oneness. It is only through the intellectual operations of the human mind that reality appears to us separated into parts or even into fragmented pieces. There is always this presupposition that the reduction of reality to distinct pieces is a legitimate means of examining it. Analytic operations, by dividing real things into bits, presuppose that they can always be reassembled back into a unit, or that the different parts resulting from the division of a unit can be added back so that they always give the same expected result. This kind of reversibility that arithmetical operations seem to exhibit cannot be applied tout court to concrete everyday experience. It can, of course, very aptly become a case of misplaced concreteness, as Whitehead would call it. If we take any one concrete being, say any mammal, and dismember it, we will very soon find out that the whole is not the sum of its parts. In the process of becoming, the whole is already there from the very beginning of this process. Parts do not supervene or add themselves to the process of becoming. They are there from the very beginning. The whole is given with its parts. Actual occasions are thus atomic because they are whole and undivided, but they are also complex, individualized, and changeless. It may seem strange that becoming presupposes changelessness. Indeed, becoming means the rejection of divisibility and change. This is true for the process of becoming, that is, while becoming proceeds. Actual entities are unitary processes of becoming with a particular character that is defined in the unity and singleness of that very process. That is why there is no change in the process of becoming. I quote Whitehead again, actual entities perish but do not change. They are what they are, unquote. If they changed, they would turn into other actual entities. Becoming and being require integrity, and integrity can be found in becoming, not in change. Change breaks the process of becoming and establishes another one. Each being preserves its integrity as it becomes and constitutes itself. Self-constitution presupposes an unchanging becoming that forms itself and respects its internal wholeness. There is no external interference from any other element of reality. In examining actual entities, we find ourselves in the realm of time. Actual occasions are temporal occasions, but their temporality differs from the traditional conception of time, which consists in a unique seriality or unique continuity of becoming. As the genetic passage proceeds, actual entities create themselves as unitary beings. However, they are not in physical time. That is to say, there is no temporal succession because actual entities are processes. Although an actual entity is the enjoyment of a certain quantum of physical time, there is no temporal succession while the actual entity becomes. Becoming is whole and undivided. And again I quote Whitehead, "This genetic passage from phase to phase is not in physical time. The exactly converse point of view expresses the relationship of concrescence to physical time. It can be put shortly by saying that physical time expresses some features of the growth, but not the growth of the features," unquote. Whitehead's insight is clear. The process of developing and maturing, normally designated growth, does not admit division or fragmentation. It is it has a unitary and unifying nature, and the introduction of a time series into any process of unveiling would irretrievably break and damage its growth. The harmonious balance of growth proceeds by imperceptible progress. There is no way of identifying or pinpointing these inextricable advances in the nature of things. Whitehead's insight could perhaps be said to be of a mystical nature. Its subtlety can surprise us, but its accuracy definitely makes us aware of the vastness and complexity of the universe, and of the astonishing creative advance instantiated in any one element in reality. Actual occasions thus create continuity as they become, but becoming is not continuous. Actual occasions are atomic in a new sense, that is, they constitute themselves as undivided wholes, and they emerge as unique individualized units of being. And I quote Whitehead again, "There is a becoming of continuity, but no continuity of becoming. The actual occasions are the creatures which become, and they constitute a continuously extensive world. In other words, extensiveness becomes, but becoming is not itself extensive. Thus, the ultimate metaphysical truth is atomism. The creatures are atomic. In the present epoch, there is a creation of continuity," unquote. The wholeness and changelessness of the process of becoming implies that becoming is not an operation of successive additions to an initial element of reality. The process of becoming is one. There are no supplements or addenda to it, neither are there any supervening incorporations. The conclusion is that in every act of becoming, there is the becoming of something with temporal extension, but the act itself is not extensive in the sense that it is divisible into earlier and later acts of becoming, which correspond to the extensive divisibility of what has become. Thus, the process of becoming is a temporal process of unchanging wholeness. The epochal duration is not realized via its successive divisible parts, but given with its parts. To sum up, actual entities are thus self-creative and self-constituting, and they are so in virtue of their own particular time spans. The process of self-constitution of an actual entity allows for becoming, but it does not allow for change. The becoming of actual entities is undivided and indivisible. The whole entity is already there from the very beginning, and it cannot be taken into parts lest it change into another actual entity. Its own particular becoming, which is neither changeable nor divisible, would be disrupted, and the result would be a different actual entity. Individuality is thus attained as a consequence of the particular becoming of each actual entity. The new actual entity is determined by its own past, but the synthesis that emerges from its prehension of the past is a novel entity. The whole antecedent world conspires to produce a new occasion, Whitehead says in Modes of Thought. Novelty is thus a result of creativity and self-determination. The discontinuous character of reality in excluding change and divisibility ad infinitum also excludes the simplicity of the ultimate elements of reality. Actual occasions are atoms, and atoms are undivided and whole. But they are not simple units. They are complex syntheses. They thus differ from the common understanding of the notion of atom, which is always that of a simple, indecomposable unit, like the atoms of Democritus. I quote again, an actual entity is not merely a one. It is also definitely complex. But to be definitely complex is to include definite diverse elements in definite ways, unquote. Complexity thus justifies diversity and relationship. Actual entities emerge from the appropriation, integration, and synthesis of other entities. By doing so, they create themselves, and from this appropriation, a novel entity emerges. A new world of diversity emerges in the novel synthesis of the novel actual entity. Creativity and novelty are only possible in a relational cosmos of acute synthetic complexity. The complexity of actual entities facilitates novelty. A unified and very complex network of relationships is the basis of diversity, whether we concern ourselves with human diversity or with the diversity of nature. But diversity is diverse in unity, and therefore must also be consonant with its own unifying, distinctive nature. Whitehead writes, the category of objective diversity expresses the inexorable condition that a complex unity must provide for each of its components a real diversity of status, with a reality which bears the same sense as its own reality and is peculiar to itself. In other words, a real unity cannot provide sham diversities of status for its diverse components. The oneness of the universe and the oneness of each element in the universe repeat themselves to the crack of doom in the creative advance from creature to creature, each creature including in itself the whole of history and exemplifying the self-identity of things and their mutual diversities. Unquote. Oneness implies repetition as well as diversity, and complexity brings with it the inclusion and repetition of antecedent factors. It enhances self-identity and mutual diversities. Each actual entity draws on the past. It finds there all the diversity and complexity needed for its formation. According to Whitehead, the past is immortal. Once the actual entity becomes and perishes, it transcends itself and becomes objectively immortal. What is done cannot be undone and will forever influence future actual occasions. The past remains stubbornly there. Many process philosophers like Henri Bergson and Sri Aurobindo have also dealt extensively with the shortcomings of analysis and division. They have insisted on the importance of oneness and unity, and they have emphasized that our habitual frames of mind, which are most useful in our everyday life, do not reflect the ultimate metaphysical principles. This leads to a confusing grasp of reality and to a not less confusing emergence of an ethics which ignores its ontological foundations. As a result, nature has been ravaged relentlessly. We will quote Aurobindo at length in a passage that could very competently illustrate Whitehead's notion of actual entity and its relevance to the construction of a harmonious living on planet Earth. Aurobindo writes, "This indivisibility of the comprehensive supermind, which contains all multiplicity without derogating from its own unity, is a truth upon which we have always to insist if we are to understand the cosmos and get rid of the initial error of our analytic mentality. A tree evolves out of the seed in which it is already contained, the seed out of the tree. The mind regards this phenomenon, this birth, life, and reproduction of a tree, as a thing in itself, and on that basis studies, classes, and explains it. It explains the tree by the seed by the tree. It declares a law of nature, but it has explained nothing. It has only analyzed and recorded the process of a mystery. It tends to regard the form as a separate existence, with its separate law of nature and process of development. In the animal and in man, with his conscious mentality, this separative tendency of the mind induces it to regard itself as a separate existence. But the supermind works otherwise. The tree and its process would not be what they are and could not exist if they were separate existences. The tree does not explain the seed, nor the seed the tree. The supermind pervading and inhabiting at once the seed and the tree and all objects lives in this greater knowledge which is indivisible and one." Unquote. This passage reminds us also of Whitehead's bifurcation of nature that leads to the primordial misunderstanding of the status of nature and mind. Mind is considered a separate entity instead of being seen as an inextricable element of nature. By bifurcating nature, we introduce endless fragmentation and ignore nature's unifying sacredness. Whitehead emphasizes that there are several ways of bifurcating nature and several theories of the bifurcation of nature, but they can all be traced back to a distinction between an apparent nature and a causal nature. Absence of relations is the consideration of the natural world leads to this separation between perception and the cause of perception. In the end, it all comes to sheer intellectual irreconcilability of the natural elements that spontaneously coexist side by side and should not be separated. In Aurobindo's passage, the allusion to the separation of the seed from the tree and the differentiation of the tree from the seed exemplifies the same error. The tree is already contained in the seed, and the seed results from the tree. This demonstrates not only the wholeness and indivisibility of the process of becoming, but also the irrevocably entangled diversity and complexity of reality. The entangled diversity results from the way actual entities incessantly become and perish. Seeds and trees are the result of this incessant creative advance. In rejecting partition and divisibility, and in defending the changeless becoming and complexity of actual entities, as well as their self-determination and self-identity, Whitehead construes a new philosophical category capable of reflecting and enhancing the nature and character of living and natural processes. Ecological civilization could greatly profit from learning about the creative and holistic dynamics of actual entities. This Whiteheadian category contradicts the traditional belief that reality is originally set in different pieces. It emphasizes organisms as self-creating and self-constituting. They become as wholes, and once taken into parts will not recover by the reverse operation of adding them up. The disruption of the regular processes of nature creates unhealthy deviations, breaking organisms into separate elements so that they are taken as disconnected parts of a fragmentary world. Western civilization has indeed spread a culture of individualistic, fragmentary, and destructive values. Globalization, in spite of having shown itself as an outdated and disastrous model, still flourishes as the banner of progress and development. The introduction of Western standards in various cultures, from South America to India, frequently led to poverty and hunger in those regions. Before the westernization of these cultures, many were balanced and healthy societies, unacquainted with poverty, with sustainable rural economies that could easily feed whole populations. The exploitation of raw materials caused much environmental damage, as well as the displacement of whole populations and the huge devastation of forests and land since the times of colonization. However, recent decades have seen unprecedented depletion of soils and woodland. Never before have such vast areas of forest been so relentlessly destroyed. Ancient forests and autochthonous species have been replaced by monocultures and fast-growing species, such as eucalyptuses in Brazil, China, India, and even in Europe. Governments and international organizations, such as the World Bank, have supported and even subsidized the plantation of these crops that cause massive loss of biodiversity, as well as the rapid aridization of soils and exhaust water resources wherever they grow. Eucalyptuses provide pulp with which glossy white paper is produced for consumer societies all over the world. They are also good fuel to supply with heating needs. Corporations behind these eucalyptus plantations perversely advertise them as sustainable forests. Western consumers thus feel relaxed and confident every time they buy and use reams of white office paper. Local populations, however, see their water resources exhausted and their fields ravaged by drought. The devastation and deforestation of vast areas of our planet is a good illustration of the disruption of the regular processes of nature. They give rise to irreversible damage, endangering the balance of life on Earth. As a result, living organisms are considered to be disconnected parts of a fragmentary world. Laws and regulations often sanction this fragmentation of the living world with clear delimitations conveying a definite status to the different disconnected pieces into which living reality is divided. Living organisms are thus converted into static entities with rigorous boundaries easily pinpointed and exchanged in commercial trade. These legal and commercial operations often end the lives of those organisms or otherwise exhaust them as breeders of life. The consistent unity and wholeness of living creatures is not compatible with our obsessive and over-intellectualized way of dividing reality, thus making it more accessible to our practical needs of everyday life. Life is fluid, whole, and astonishingly complex, and so are living creatures. Living beings live in a web of relationships, in a constant process of becoming and overlapping. We could say they are rhythmic creatures, building their lives as they go, and as they feel and interact with their milieu. We will draw on some ecological civilizations with vernacular cultures to illustrate how important the creative and holistic self-constitution of actual entities which emerges from an ever-resurgent past is for a new ecological civilization. We will take the example of the Ifugao terraces in the Philippines. These terraces are more than 2,000 years old and have been constantly maintained by the indigenous local community. The indigenous community has survived 4 centuries of colonization and 2 colonizing powers, as well as the introduction of a system of centralized government in Western style at the beginning of the 20th century. They have consistently preserved their traditional farming systems, which include forest conservation as a way to sustain irrigation at great altitudes. The rice terraces are a living environment and also a living landscape. They produce one of the world's most important staple crops, which is rice. They are run and tended by the local community using traditional techniques that date back many centuries. These agricultural engineering techniques still function today and maintain a sort of primordial harmony between the human community and the natural environment. Moreover, they present themselves as more competent agricultural techniques than modern technologies, which are environmentally questionable and disregard any kind of integrated and holistic method for working the land. The rice terraces are an example of a great human realization, as well as an important environmental and aesthetical achievement, which ally ancestral sustainable farming practices with a thorough respect for the natural and sacred sources of life. However, their preservation will only be possible if ancestral property rights are respected and maintained. The introduction of Western property standards and regulations in indigenous communities has shown itself to be a disastrous procedure all over the world. In general, autochthonous communities have no idea about ownership, individual property rights, and the property market. Many regard themselves as the sheer custodians of the land they keep and hand on to future generations. In fact, the introduction of Western property concepts in indigenous societies, whether they are of a pure capitalist nature or of a Marxist kind, boils down to the usurpation of the land, long protected by legitimate and ancestral rights. In these communities, custom law normally regulates the use of land. Customary law systems promote a moderate and sustainable use of land and natural resources. They respect biodiversity and human integrity. Farming techniques and religious and social practices intermingle and concur in the creation of a harmonious and sustainable agricultural community protected by a law system that conforms to ancestral practices and natural cycles. But state law, once introduced in these societies, is not consistent with customary law. Neither is it respectful of ancestral practices. State law introduces individualistic notions of appropriation of the land or collectivistic models which are equally disruptive and of an equally fragmentary nature. They completely distort the ecological and cultural balances that have been maintained for many centuries. They also lead to the loss of identity and to cultural annihilation. Oftentimes, they even lead to the complete destructions of the communities. The rice terraces in the Philippines preserve the work of an endless number of generations, of a community that consistently renewed itself through more than 2,000 years. The community have handed down the rice terraces to succeeding generations and are a living testimony to a coherent, harmonious and sustainable land use that has respected the cycles of nature and has been consonant with human cycles and human integrity as well. Such a model represents a deep understanding of nature, considered as one inextricable whole. In our days, these ancestral engineering techniques continue to show themselves as outstanding agricultural methods. They also demonstrate the community's invaluable knowledge of nature, which is used in such practical matters as pest control and soil conservation, as well as in social and religious practices. There is certainly a holistic and most complex way of living, which could be described in its singularity and authenticity through the depiction of Whitehead's actual entities. The category of actual entity can shed some light on the necessity to reconsider nature as a unified and complex whole that should not be fragmented into separate pieces in order to satisfy the greedy needs of our Western civilization. Indigenous communities regard the ecological system as a unitary whole. They have shared the cosmos with other living beings and considered the earth the source of all life. They have lived in harmony and in reciprocal commitment to the preservation and maintenance of their shared milieu. They have acted as the keepers of our planet, handing it down to successive generations. Whitehead refused the bifurcation of nature, as well as the disintegration of the world into discrete and unrelated elements. Human loss of integrity, as well as our refusal to consider ourselves an integral part of the natural world, can only take us to disaster. We need to rediscover our humanity, and that will only be possible when we welcome the humble and yet noble ontological condition of each and every actual entity. Actual entities are unique and novel, and they keep reinventing whatever the past has settled as complete and irrevocable. The undivided process of becoming of each and every actual entity that draws on the complexity of the past gives place to a novel and self-determined entity exemplifying the works of creativity in the world. The past, which is always present, is the indispensable requisite for the constitution of the living novelty that keeps repeating itself in the creative advance until the end of times. That's all.